I was 12 years old the night my grandmother grabbed my wrist so hard I thought she might break it. Her hand was paper thin by then, all bones and veins, and that translucent skin old people get when they're close to the end. But her grip was iron. The kerosene lamp on her nightstand was burning low, and the whole room smelled like camphor and lavender, and something underneath that I now know was the smell of a body shutting down. My mother had sent me upstairs to sit with her while she finished cleaning the supper dishes. I thought I was just keeping company. I was wrong. She pulled me close, so close I could feel her breath on my ear, and she said 7 words I have carried with me for 64 years. Then she made me swear, not on the Bible, not before God. She made me swear on her grave, the grave she would be in within 3 days. And then she said one more sentence, a sentence so strange, so completely out of place, coming from a baptized old order Amish woman of 79 years, that I went home that night and cried myself to sleep because I didn't understand what she meant. It took me almost 5 decades to understand. And when I finally did, I sat down in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had baked bread every Friday morning for 50 years, and I wept. Not the soft kind of weeping, the kind that comes from the bottom of your stomach, the kind that empties you out. Because I realized my grandmother, this woman the community had buried with full honors, this woman whose name was still spoken with reverence at every quilting bee in 3 counties, had been carrying a secret her entire adult life. And on her deathbed, she had handed that secret to me, a 12-year-old girl in pigtails, because there was no one else she could trust with it. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you about what an Amish grandmother whispered to her granddaughter in the year 1962 is going to change the way you think about silence, about obedience, and about the women who came before us. My name is Anna. I'm 76 years old. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in a time when the world moved slower and the rules were stricter, and I left the community when I was 51 years old, an age when most people are settling in, not starting over. This channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my generation was never allowed to say out loud. If you want to hear more hidden truths from behind the prayer cap, please subscribe, tap the like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and at my age, every message matters. Now, let me give you some context, because to understand what my grandmother did, you have to understand the world she lived in. My grandmother, her name was Fanny, was born in 1883. Think about that for a moment. 1883. She was a grown woman before the Model T existed. She lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the polio epidemic, and she never once rode in an automobile of her own free will. She married my grandfather at 17 years old in 1900. She bore 11 children, buried 3 of them before they reached the age of 5, and she ran a household of 15 people on a 140-acre dairy farm with nothing but her own 2 hands, a wood stove, and a kerosene lamp. In her world, the rules for women were not written down because they didn't need to be. Every girl learned them the same way, by watching. A wife rises before her husband. A wife eats after her children. A wife speaks softly or not at all in the presence of men. A wife endures. That last one. A wife endures. That was the whole theology of being female in her generation. Endurance was the highest virtue, Whatever came, sickness, loss, exhaustion, sorrow, you swallowed it down and you kept going because complaining was a kind of pride, and pride was the worst sin of all. And my grandmother, by every external measure, was the most enduring woman in our entire church district. She was the one the bishop's wife called when a baby was sick. She was the one who sat with the dying. She was the one whose pies won the prizes and whose quilts hung in the front parlor at every wedding. When she died in October of 1962, her funeral filled 3 barns. People came from as far away as Ohio and Indiana. The bishop himself wept at her graveside. She was, in the eyes of our community, the perfect Amish woman, which is why what she whispered to me that night made no sense at all. Not until I was nearly 60 years old. Let me take you back to that bedroom. It was the 3rd week of October. The harvest was finished. The air outside smelled like wood smoke and frost. She had been sick for almost 4 months by then. Something in her stomach the English doctor in town had wanted to operate on, but she had refused. She said if it was the Lord's will to take her, she would not interfere. She had been moved into the downstairs bedroom because she could no longer climb the stairs. The whole family had been taking turns sitting with her. That night was my turn. I was 12. I was wearing my plain green dress with the white apron my mother had made me for my last birthday. My hair was in 2 braids pinned up under my prayer covering. I sat in the wooden chair beside her bed, and I read to her from the Ausbund, the old Amish hymn book, because she had asked me to. Her eyes were closed. I thought she was asleep, and then without warning, her hand shot out from under the quilt and clamped down on my wrist. I jumped. I almost dropped the book. Her eyes were open now, and they were so clear, so present, so completely awake, that for a moment I forgot she was dying. She pulled me down toward her. I could smell the camphor on her chest where my mother had rubbed it that morning, and she said very quietly, very deliberately, "Promise me you will not stay if it breaks you." 7 words. That was it. I didn't understand. I said, "Grossmammy, what do you mean?" She squeezed my wrist tighter. She said it again. "Promise me, Anna, that you will not stay if it breaks you. Swear it on my grave. Swear it now, before I go." I was 12 years old. I had no idea what she was talking about. But the urgency in her voice, the strength in that bony hand, the way her eyes burned into mine, I would have promised her anything. I said, "I swear, Grossmammy, I swear on your grave." And then she relaxed. She let go of my wrist. She closed her eyes. And then in a whisper so soft I almost missed it, she said the sentence I would carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "I should have left in 1907. May God forgive me for staying." I went home that night and I cried myself to sleep. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone. Some part of me, even at 12, understood that what my grandmother had said to me was dangerous, that if I repeated it, I would be betraying her in some way I didn't yet have the words for. So I kept it inside. And as the years went by, I tried to forget it. But you don't forget something like that. It just sinks down into the bottom of you and waits. I want you to understand something about the world I grew up in, because it matters for what came next. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Amish community I belonged to was even more closed than it is today. There was no electricity, no telephones in the house, no contact with the outside world, except for the necessary trips into town for things we couldn't grow or make ourselves. Women in particular lived in a kind of beautiful prison. The barn was the husband's domain. The kitchen was the wife's. And between those two spaces stretched a whole lifetime of work that was supposed to be enough. I married Eli when I was 19 years old. He was a good man. I want to say that clearly because what I'm about to tell you is not a story about a cruel husband. Eli was kind. He was hard-working. He never raised his hand to me, not once in 32 years of marriage. He brought me wildflowers from the back pasture every spring. He held my hand under the table at supper when he thought no one was looking. By every measure that mattered in our community, I had a good marriage. And yet, by the time I was 40, something inside me had begun to crack. I don't know how else to describe it. I would be standing at the sink washing dishes, the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and I would feel this enormous wave of something I had no name for. Not sadness exactly, not anger, just a kind of vast, quiet grief for a life I hadn't lived, a self I hadn't been allowed to become. I would shake it off. I would tell myself I was being selfish, that I had everything a woman could want, a husband, 6 children, a home, a community. I would pray about it. The pastor said it was the devil tempting me toward worldliness. I tried to believe him, but the cracks kept widening. My friend Mary, who lived 3 farms over, was going through the same thing, though it took us years to admit it to each other. We would meet at the produce stand on Saturday mornings, our buggies parked side by side, and we would talk in careful, coded sentences. She would say, "Some mornings I cannot get out of bed, Anna. I do not know what is wrong with me." And I would say, "I know, Mary, I know." And neither of us would say more than that, because to say more would be to admit that the life we had been promised, the life we had been told would fulfill us, was somehow not enough. And that admission was forbidden. There was no theology to hold it. There was no scripture to comfort it. There was only the wife who endured and the wife who failed. When Mary died at 48 of what the doctor called heart failure, but what I have come to understand was something much sadder, I sat at her funeral and I felt my grandmother's hand on my wrist again. "Promise me you will not stay if it breaks you." I was 43 years old, and for the first time I understood what she had meant. It took me 8 more years to act on it. 8 years of slow, quiet preparation that no one in my family ever noticed. I started saving small amounts of egg money in a coffee can buried behind the smokehouse. I learned to drive on a friend's car when I made the rare trip into the city to see a specialist for my back. I read every book I could find at the library in town, hiding them in my apron when I came home. I taught myself things my grandmother could never have imagined, things about psychology, about the inner life of women, about the slow erosion that happens when a person spends 50 years swallowing themselves down. I left on a Tuesday morning in March of 1998. I was 51 years old. My youngest child had married the year before. Eli was out in the barn with his brother working on a piece of equipment. I packed one small suitcase. I left a letter on the kitchen table. I walked to the end of the lane, where a friend from town was waiting to drive me to a women's shelter 60 miles away. I did not look back. If I had looked back, I would not have been able to do it. The shunning came swiftly. Within 2 weeks, my children had been instructed by the bishop to have no contact with me. My letters to them were returned unopened. My grandchildren, the ones I had rocked to sleep, the ones I had baked bread for every Saturday morning, were told their grossmammy had chosen Satan over family. I have not seen 4 of my 6 children in 28 years. I have grandchildren I have never held, great-grandchildren whose names I do not know. The cost has been enormous. I will not lie to you about that. There are mornings, even now, even at 76, when the grief sits on my chest like a stone. But here is the other truth, the truth my grandmother knew, the truth she could not bring herself to act on in 1907, and so passed down to me in a whisper instead. I am alive, not just breathing, alive. I have read 300 books since I left. I have learned to use a computer. I have traveled to the ocean, the same ocean I dreamed about as a girl. I have made friends who know my real name, who have heard my real laugh, who have seen me cry without telling me it was a sin. I have become, at long last, a person. 2 years ago, I found out through a cousin who occasionally writes to me that my granddaughter, my oldest daughter's oldest girl, had left the community. She was 23. She came to find me. She sat at my kitchen table, and she cried for an hour. And then she said, "Grossmammy, I had to know if you were real because they told us you weren't." And I held her hand, the same way my grandmother had held mine 64 years before. And I told her the whole story, the promise, the whisper, the sentence Fanny had carried for 55 years and could not bring herself to speak until she was dying. And then I asked my granddaughter to swear the same promise to me, not on a grave, on her own life, that if it ever broke her, she would leave. She swore it. We cried together until the kerosene lamp on the table burned low. My grandmother spent 79 years being the perfect Amish woman, and on her deathbed, her last act was to make sure her granddaughter would not have to do the same. That is the kind of love that does not fit in any sermon I ever heard preached. It does not fit in the Ordnung. It does not fit in the theology of endurance. It is a love that says, I could not save myself, but I will save you, even if it takes 50 years. That is the love I want you to remember when you think about Amish grandmothers. Not the quilts, not the pies, the whispered promises in the dark. If you grew up in a world where staying was called faithfulness and leaving was called sin, I see you. If you have ever made a promise to yourself in the dark that you were too afraid to keep, I see you. And if no one in your life has ever told you that your one wild and precious life belongs to you, I am telling you now, at 76 years old, with everything I have left, it belongs to you. It always did. Leave me a comment. Tell me about a grandmother in your life. Tell me about a promise you made, or one you wish you had. And if you want to keep hearing the truth the prayer cap was meant to hide, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. I have so many more stories to tell, and at my age, I do not plan to waste a single one. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. Some of them were paid for by women you will never meet.